Hello, everyone. A very good morning from this warm, sunny part of the world. Welcome to another episode of Belong to the Future, where we explore the big questions shaping our world today and tomorrow. I'm your host, Megha, and in this episode, we're diving deep into an issue that affects us all, but most pointedly, our children, and that is climate change. We often hear about rising temperatures, melting ice caps, and disappearing biodiversity. But behind the scientific data, the stats, and the headlines, there's something that is often overlooked, and that is our future generations. If we leave them behind in the way we think about climate solutions, we will miss the mark by a mile in future proofing ourselves. Think of it this way: the world is changing fast, and yet, too often, we're still designing our solutions with a narrow view of the present. But what about tomorrow? What about those who will inherit this world, who will live with the consequences of our actions long after we're gone? This reminds me of a poem by the late Mary Oliver. And she writes, "Tell me, what is it you plan to do with your one wild and precious life?" Now imagine, what will they do with their wild and precious lives if we do not act? If we don't think about them in our decisions today? Our children, our grandchildren, they're not just bystanders in the story, they are the protagonists. Climate change, it doesn't wait, and neither should we. In this episode, we'll explore why it's not just enough to make changes for ourselves, but why it's essential to build a future that honors the world we are leaving behind. I'm supremely thrilled about today's episode as I have the incredible opportunity to host not one, but two superheroes from the Learning Planet Institute in Paris. If you're not familiar with it, this institute is taking bold, audacious steps to tackle some of the biggest challenges of our time, one of which is shaping the future of learning. A major highlight of their work is the annual Learning Planet festivals, and folks, it's something you do not want to miss. Created to mark the International Day of Education on January 24th, the festival has already been a massive success, bringing together 80,000 young people from around the world to celebrate and explore how we can all take better care of ourselves, each other, and our planet. And guess what? The 2025 edition promises to be even bigger, bolder, and more transformative. This year, the focus is on co designing the future of learning with youth because let's face it, they are the ones who will carry this vision forward. The festival will once again shine a spotlight on groundbreaking collaborations and inspiring events that touch on some of the most critical topics of our time: education, for inner development, for peace, sustainability, so on and so forth. I'm excited to dive into today's conversation with our incredible guests who are at the heart of all this action. We're going to explore how we can empower the next generation of changemakers and co create a future that truly works for everyone. So let's get started. Today we have Edward and Mia Manu Abraham from the Institute joining us on the show. It's a pleasure to host you, Edward and Mia. Welcome to Belong to the Future, a podcast where we double click on the role of education to raise a more informed, aware, and equipped generation. Or as the Institute's website says, learning planetizens. I'm really thrilled to have you guys here. Welcome once again to the podcast.
Thanks so much for having us. Great to be here.
Thank you, Megha.
Amazing. Let's dive right in. I was about to wish you guys a very happy new year, but I also realized the new year has rung in with one of the most horrific wildfire events in the world history, right? An urban firestorm in the Los Angeles metro area that has killed at least 5 people, as far as the latest news says, and reduced thousands of homes to smoking rubble. This may not be just the deadliest wildfire yet. It is one of the costliest in terms of financial, mental, emotional, and we can go on, right? The world truly is bearing, as per me, the repercussions of a changing climate, of a warming planet. In this scenario, I think it's critical we act fast, we act responsible, and amongst others, I think education, inclusion, they become super, super critical. And Learning Planet Institute's mission to explore, research, and share new ways of learning and cooperating in order to respond to the needs of the youth and the planet hence becomes super important, becomes cardinal. And I was reading on the website, in fact, that to establish this new and unique approach to education. The institute puts equal focus on R&D, education, international alliance, transformation of organization, so on and so forth. And what a wonderful way to really approach education as a weapon, as I mean, for the lack of better word, a tool to sort of um, you know address the climate change. And I was also reading on the website that there 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 are multiple initiatives that the institute does, and one of those initiatives is the annual the design challenge, right, Edward? So I'll start with you. The Learning Planet Design Challenge for this year is here. The initiative invites young people aged 15 to 26 to present their ideas for creating a new generation of universities, one that are tailored to address global challenges, developed with and for the youth. Sounds very intriguing, very interesting. Could you share more about the challenge and how you believe it encourages youth to take a more active role in shaping the discourse on climate action?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. And yeah, I think it's a really important point to start that we're having this conversation in a period of, I would say, unlike no other, but it feels like it's becoming all the more common, of climate catastrophe and immense pain. And really heart goes out to anybody listening as well in those kinds of environments too. And at least I suppose what gives me hope in those moments, it's really difficult, is spending a lot of time with incredible young people
Yeah.
like Miya in this school around the world, but also very close by too, who genuinely believe that there are things that we can do to make the world a better place, and bringing young people into that process as well. And that's really where we started with this Youth Design Challenge. We work a lot with the UN, with UNESCO, with universities, but ever since we started in our work, a question has been, what is the space for young people in conversations about particularly the future of education, knowing that that intersects completely with issues of climate, of peace, of well-being, and much, much more as well. And so last year we started by our first design challenge saying we invite young people around the world to propose a learning program on the theme of either flourishing, so really on well-being, particularly engagement, and that was very much centered around engagement on peace building. And then lastly, and I think most relevant as well for this podcast, around sustainability, so on climate education. And so it's been an amazing journey. This year we had from 1,000 signing up from, I think, 105 countries. We've had 270 final programs which have been proposed, and we've been through this journey over the last couple of months in evaluating them with the help of a global partners in our pre-jury, in our main jury, and just at the point of announcing our cohort of 12 finalists and
That's
prizes.
mm,
And so this is really what I'd say for us, this demonstrates is there is a wealth of incredible youth ideas, particularly for education and sustainability worldwide. There are young people desperate and so willing to be
yeah.
developing projects and solutions. And so we're really here as much as possible to help them on that journey.
Wow, interesting. You said 1,000 applications from over 105 countries. That's really impressive. Edward, over to you again. I was reading in 2016, Wales became the first country to appoint a future generations commissioner, essentially a guardian of future generations' interest, right? And under the Well-being of Future Generations Act, you also hosted a meet and greet with the UNESCO Most British Coalition to explore how to implement these recommendations on a global scale. Could you share more about the experience and how this initiative might amplify the conversation around climate change policies, particularly in terms of youth inclusion? What do you envision for the future of this initiative?
Yeah, absolutely. So, in the case we've got to know very well, and this is part of our work with UNESCO and connecting to not just multilateral organisations but also governments. We've followed very closely the work in Wales, which was the first country to have a Future Generations Commissioner, and that the idea is that is looking across policies, across government. How do we ensure that all the policies and the decisions that we take now are with the well-being of future generations in mind? And so naturally the well-being of the young people in these conversations is absolutely crucial, given they're the decision makers as well for the future. So we've had a series of different kinds of meet and greets. one notably recently in Paris, bringing together young people, students here with members of UNESCO and also connected to the Future Generations Commission to look at what is the responsibility of these big organizations to be having youth voice across policy. And I think where climate came into that is that, and we'll perhaps touch on it a little bit later as well. I know Mia's had experience here that the wealth and the growth of eco anxiety is so prevalent and rampant across youth generation, young generation. A real fear associated with seeing the impact of climate change right now. And so something that we've and came out of those conversations is having a set of criteria and propositions for how young people come in to these discussions across different policy, going beyond just climate, but understanding its relationship to the well-being of young people, to the education space as well. And so at the same time, the challenge that we find is how to turn conversation into action, and that was a huge part of it is that as much as we can write the reports, the responsibility is to find also like the ways, the approaches to bring youth into the action, and that leads immediately to decisions happening. And so I think that that's really a big objective over the course of this year as well.
Interesting. Ed, in fact, when you spoke about climate anxiety, I remembered Leslie Davenport. She's a climate psychologist from the United States, and she was on my podcast a few days back. And she spoke about climate anxiety and how really it's actually a real thing, right? And so many young people are actually going through it, and that and it's conspicuous that people are actually seeing conspicuous it's actually real, right? It's not something that we just hear about, right? And I'll come on, Mia, you work with a lot of youth. I see that at the Learning Planet Institute, you've worked with over 600 youth fellows, and you also sort of work around the well-being of youth, right? So my next question is on to you. I understand, that you're also involved in leading initiatives that explore the intersection of education, the arts, and climate, particularly in how education can promote planetary well-being and ecological justice, right? Could you highlight some key areas or initiatives that you believe have the potential to drive the meaningful change?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Megha. I think every initiative is worth doing and is worth exploring in terms of all the things that you have mentioned. As for Learning Planet, in my particular position as a youth community manager, we have two initiatives for sure. One, as Ed mentioned, is the Design Challenge, of course, collecting dreams and hopes from all parts of the world. And those are not my words. I'm quoting Ed, to be honest. But the other one is the Youth Fellows community. We are 600 plus, growing every day. And we meet both formally and informally on monthly Saturday calls to talk about how we can put things in perspective, be it climate, be it art, themes of ikigai, peace, or whatever is that we want to discuss. And we also have larger WhatsApp groups to talk about things, everything ranging from the wildfires to, small local initiatives or workshops that Youth Fellows conduct. So those are certain things that we do. And the second part of the same question about areas that I believe can produce meaningful change. Consciousness of what you do in itself is a big deal. Starting from closing the tap, which is a very simple action, to turning off the light when you don't need it, to vocalizing things in the classroom, be it, it is not limited to a school classroom, but even in university and doing your research. I guess like conscious action is the answer to most of the problems.
Yeah. Yeah. This is, I'm having a deja vu moment because, again, I had Ed. He's a primary school teacher. Again, Ed Moore. He's based out of Bali, and I think he also participated in one of the challenges from the institute. But he spoke about so many aspects of child education since primary schooling, where you spoke about, Mia, is about consciousness, right? Small steps, where closing the tap, or how do you come to school, by cycling and not using a car, and that has a ripple effect on how your parents or the larger ecosystem around you also reacts to these habits, right? And it's such a wonderful way to sort of deal with climate through daily actions, right? On that, I would want to ask you, Mia, how do you see youth leadership evolving in the climate and wider social action movement, right? Are there particular examples of youth led initiatives that have made an impact in promoting climate justice and environmental sustainability?
Of course, I mean, thank you for that question again. I guess one, young people are already doing everything that they can, starting from, I guess, the person who inspired me the most was Greta before the Swedish parliament. And that was honestly a long time ago, but just the impact a single person can have, that changed my perspective on climate and made me want to learn more about greenhouse gases and see it as something more than a chapter in the last page of my textbook.
Yeah.
So definitely, I guess it all started from one person for me, but anybody can be that one person for anybody. Honestly, the fact that young people are doing so much, it's a big and brave thing in a world where young people are seen as inexperienced, just young, having fun, and even with labels like, oh, they don't read newspapers, what would they know? As for like, I guess like also in the social impact and social action part, I don't think it's easy to consider it just individual action because just like the Learning Planet Youth Fellows community, or even as simple as the Design Challenge participants, we have our own spaces to talk. You really see the spirit. And it can be a person who is walking into LPI or a person you connect with outside of LPI. Everybody has that spirit. So now it also takes form of a communal thing. I guess more for it to be amplified, we need systemic change. And honestly, as an activist, and I guess I can't speak for my friends who are taking brave steps as well. And now we need systemic action.
Yeah, yeah. Uh, and may I just, a follow-up question to that, and I hear you when you say that, there is a lot of interest, and a lot of youth, they really want to participate in the whole equation. But despite this growing interest in climate issues, young people often face challenges in being taken seriously in climate discussions. What do you think are the main barriers preventing youth from being more actively involved in shaping climate policies and solutions?
Yeah, that's a very true fact. I guess apart from like these general ideas or general difficulties like geographical barriers, cultures, we cannot address it without that. Politics as well. There is the main element of intergenerational difference. The fact that older people believe that young people are doing silly work and younger generations believe that older people will never understand. That is a issue that we have to address. And if you, as Ed was speaking, I mean, almost the same thing in different words. There is gap in how policies are made. Policies are not essentially made keeping in mind what the future generation wants, but honestly thinking what might be best for them without even consulting them. So I guess it's a intergenerational gap in how policies are made. I also think it has its own nuances based on where you come from, your economic background, and also not really having communities that promote young people to speak up and open up their mind and share their voices. And to give you a better example, even in instances of different rights happening in different parts of the world, colonialism and all those elements, just the fact that we have an informal WhatsApp group for the youth fellows, we see the spirit. I guess there are a couple of barriers, but at this point, it also extends to systemic barriers.
Yeah, very rightly said, Mia. And that also once, I just a sec.
No problem. Take your time.
Yeah, so it brings me to my next question. And while we're talking about a lot of global issues, I think, and we divided by geographies and we divided by old cultures and thinking, but I think in the face of changing climate and the repercussions that we're bearing, I think we are in it together, right? And hence, while the global action is essential, local solutions are often where most immediate impact can be made, right? And how can, so my next question, and this to both you and Ed, how can educational systems empower you to take leadership roles in local climate solutions? And what kind of support do you think they need to make this happen?
It's a question of who wants to go first, because I know both of us have ideas.
Well, I can jump in, but it'll be partly to give a shout out to some of Mia's work on it, but also completely agreeing with what she just shared as well, of these massive gaps that does happen. Perhaps I just wanted to mention actually some of the things that we've been trying to do, that is to try and give young people the tools and
Mhm,
these spaces to
mhm,
be able to showcase how and what their initiatives, their ideas are for climate action, for impact as well. And so I did want to mention briefly our festival that we have coming up on that, but I thought first, Mia, just the on the toolkit and what you've been working on climate activism for youth. I think it'd be lovely to share because it's a nice example.
Well, thank you, Ed. Yeah, as a part of today with the rest of the team, I collected a couple of resources, podcasts, really good activists who are doing groundbreaking work, most of them being young people, and also a lot of youth movements. Maybe we can share it with you at the end of the podcast for all your listeners, but that is one way, really spreading the knowledge. Maybe I can continue with that as for the rest of the question. Sorry, I forgot the question. But as for the continuation, making science, especially climate science, not the last few pages of the textbook, but rather the first pages, and giving it the same priority as everything else that they teach in school, and having communities, especially be it your municipalities, be it your neighborhoods, having strong communities that teach about the importance of having trees, having shades, having water, sharing resources, etc., can also be a part of it, I guess. Ed, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, 100%. And I was building actually on you mentioned earlier. I think everything it has to start with conversations, and that no significant initiative has ever happened without a small group of people coming together to make that change. I know that there's someone that gave that quote, and maybe Mia can help me find it, but it does stick with me a lot. But to a couple of the things that have come up for us, we also say there's not one defined climate curriculum globally, national curriculum on climate education. And so we've been working in the past, for instance, with young teachers through a Teachers to the Planet program, trying to identify 100 examples of climate change curriculums. And so there's an amazing repository online that was done with other partners that I think gives a little bit of an inspiration. And a lot of these are really young teachers that are creating these programs in their own time. But that's a number of these were presented at COP last year. And that's been one of the focus points, is that how can you give that create a space for young people, in this case particularly young educators, to be able to showcase that it is possible to integrate meaningful kind of education on climate into the system, and that is what then needs to happen in order to convince the decision makers that this needs to be systemic and that this can't just be an after school club or something on the side. And then on that, just a second shout out is next week. So at the end of January, we'll be with hundreds of organizations around the world recognize the International Day of Education with UNESCO through our Learning Planet Festival. And just as one example, there's hundreds of events happening in person and online uh,
mm,
on the festival program of organizations around the world. So one really nice one that I liked is from the UNSDSN. So it's related to the UN, but it's an initiative that came out of Columbia University in the US. But
mm,
it's got youth activists and volunteers around the world. And they've been doing an incredible series called UN at the Doorstep, connecting young activists, particularly on climate and on sustainability, with UN leaders. And so one of those sessions will open up the festival next week online. And again, it is a conversation, and we might not be able to prove that that leads to a concrete decision that gets taken, but it's got to start somewhere. And these are really young, incredible people that have really strong ideas, and that by demonstrating that there are these spaces, then it builds the case for the policymakers and the decision makers that people are demanding positive change and action, particularly when it comes to climate.
yeah. In fact, in Bangalore, where I'm from right now, we have a summit that's coming in towards the end of January. It's called Climate Ed Summit, and we have people who are, from teachers to scientists to young people who are coming in and speaking at the panel. So, there are a lot of, like you were speaking at different in different parts of the world, in different pockets. There are these summits, and these are these initiatives that are happening, and hence I think the local, there is a voice in these local pockets that are demanding a change. But I would want to also understand, what role do you think international collaborations or these initiatives at the global scale, how do they play, in what role do they play in fostering a sense of collective responsibility and shared action on climate among young people? But I think you're unmuted.
Sorry about that. Excuse me. I was saying actually that I really would love to hear and give as much space to Mia on this point, given she has so much more experience than I have in navigating international spaces as a climate activist. And I think there's so much you could share from movers and from the experience of engaging. I think what I would just say to start is that we do try to engage as much as possible with international summits, whether that's ECOSOC happens more than annually at the UN in New York. And that's really a space to connect young people with civil society and decision makers. And it does provide real connection, and it can give real visibility to youth initiatives. But at the same time, every time there's a real challenge of access into these kinds of spaces. And we speak about this a lot with the UN youth team as well. And so I think as much as possible, we're trying to make the case for either these initiatives need to be going to the regions as well that are really being impacted by the climate emergency, but also especially to make use of all of the bottom up local initiatives and giving space to showcase those collaborations and how they've worked as well. But yeah, I don't know what you think, Mia, as well, from your experience being an activist through COVID period and through since of online collaboration, but also local community work as well.
Mm, I really appreciate, and I think it's a valuable perspective you put in, Ed. We have to see the positive before the critical point that I'm going to share. Honestly, I believe that all words and no action doesn't make a lot of sense, especially in a space like climate work. And lately, at least from my personal standpoint, and I know that a lot of climate activists will agree with it, COPs and other international summits have become a space for networking rather than action.
Hmm.
And these networking spaces are limited to those who have economic safety nets, for example, just to blatantly say, who are wealthy. Two, who are born or are in countries that have high passport ranking. For
Hmm.
example, activist who is educating an indigenous community, for example, in any African country or any South Asian, well, global South country, does not have equal access or equal power as a person who is from global north, who might be doing much less important work, and they might be the person who gets access to COPs or other international summits as compared to the one who is really doing groundbreaking work and important work. And so that is a critical point I really have to push for. And also, I want to let you and the other listeners know that I speak as a person who is from the global south, who has experienced this before, I guess. So that is one way of thinking about it. And I guess it's high time that UN and other spaces that hold international summits take that into consideration. And before I pass it to Ed, one last thing is that I believe Azerbaijan is hosting the COP this year.
Hmm.
Yeah, and also we have seen COP partnerships with Coca-Cola, and I believe they're on LinkedIn. We were really talking about it and debating about it and how fair it is.
Hmm.
Maybe not. I don't think Coca-Cola is sponsoring it this year, but a few years ago, if I'm not wrong, when it was in Glasgow. So please fact check my words. But I was protesting against Coca-Cola for a COP, and there are a couple of activists called Erin Remblance, if I'm not wrong. She's from the UK. We had a document. We're collecting signatures, fighting against it. So that really opens eyes to why is COP happening if you're partnering with people who are really active polluters, who have so much control over global resources, be it water, be it oil, who are not using it for good, and who do not respect or have not previously respected indigenous communities, their values, and in some way are benefiters of colonialism. So I guess those are certain questions that we need to ask internally, just not just individual communication, but then systems like UN need to ask themselves internally if COP or other international summits are held to talk about issues that are super important. Should things like that come into play, or yeah. I guess this is daily conversation for Ed and I at work, but now it's time for yeah, more people to listen to as well.
Yeah, I
My
was just going to say and can 100% agree, and to add in that for the very few young people that get to these spaces, often it comes with an immense burden to carry as well, because it's representing often huge numbers of people. And I got to know well the Indigenous caucus that came from Australia back to ECOSOC last April, and being, have firstly getting and understanding these spaces of power that have been there and exist and important to make decisions,
mm,
but that at the same time, have been made on this kind of adversarial like way of collaborating that is very unfamiliar. And they were
mm,
saying in kind of an indigenous context. And so I think for the young people making the incredible change in climate that even do get to these spaces, so much care has to be taken and more needs to be taken on actually, like the youth generation is often the only generation one that said at UN who are asked to represent the views of their whole generation, and so
mm.
that comes with a lot of weight. And so knowing that like the care is taken for them is absolutely crucial, and there's always more that we can do that.
Wow, you guys truly call spade a spade. This was really, really very pertinent of what the points that I've put across because around COP, I see a lot of my colleagues and people who are interested in, are watching the space. That's a conversation that even we have, right? Because COP has just become a dog and pony show, right? It's just, like you said, networking and big names thrown around, but the real action is truly missing, right? On that one, Mia, I mean, I have and it's the last question before we wrap up today's conversation is the climate change affects communities, and you've touched about this in your response right now. It affects communities in very different ways, right? What are the unique challenges of ensuring that marginalized youth, such as those from the low income communities or global south nations, are included in climate action efforts?
I guess it's a very broad question that cannot be answered from one perspective
Mm-hmm.
alone. So I will be only adding very lightly to the big bucket full of resources that already exist. I mean, we have to address the elephant in the room, the heat in global south. The temperatures are shooting. I come from a very small state in India called Kerala, global, like at the south, and my grandma is 98 years old. And honestly, she keeps repeating every single year, especially in the last few years, this is the hottest winter I've ever faced. This is the hottest summer. And she's 98, so she has so many years of, she has been alive for so many years. Um, and as a child, maybe the temperature rise would go up to 5 degrees Celsius, 0 to 5 during December. And now it's 25 to 28 degrees Celsius. And this, apart from the fact that you can just say temperature is rising, and heat is going up. There's so much science behind it. Countries like Bangladesh will flood. There's going to be impeccable destruction in Vietnam, in Southeast Asia. Countries like mine will have, more wildfires. People are going to die, drought, etc. Honestly, the implications are massive, massive, massive. And as for how we can address it, young people, especially in India, I can speak for that, we are aware of what's happening and we're fighting. And as a person who has worked across Asia, particularly Asia Pacific, we know what's happening. Indigenous leaders are fighting as well. So we have individual action that's already happening. We have communal action that's already happening. Now it's time for systemic action. especially governments, you have to realize that you need to trust young people and give them more power and take decisions that is in their favor. And that can be, as Ed was suggesting, have a national curriculum, but then it could also be having positions opened in the government just for ministries dedicated for climate, but then having young people voice out their opinions, having researchers who are very well qualified be in those spaces. I mean, before X, Twitter was a space where climate action was debated and spoken about a lot. And now it's LinkedIn. We don't know how the system is going to change with X. We have seen that the difference in how we can trust social media has also changed. So disseminate information that you have freely, open source research articles, open source networks where people can read about it. That could be one as well. But honestly, systemic change is what can make most of the impact, considering we already have individual action and a good number of communal activities happening.
Yeah. Edward, anything that you would want to add?
I couldn't say it any better, and it was an education for me hearing that. And I think, yeah, uh, Mia's words, I think, sum it up absolutely exactly what we need to be thinking about. So can't add any
Yeah,
more there.
and yeah, in fact, I come from Delhi, which is capital of India, right? And every winter there's a conversation about pollution that really engulfs the whole city, right? And it's very interesting to see how with the changing governments, the manifesto really does not ever have climate or anything around climate justice or climate action, right? I hear a lot of youth talking about while they would want to go and vote, but they would also want to see fresh perspectives or take on how manifestos really are broadened up to include issues like climate change, right? Because in India, and like Mia was talking, the Pacific Islands in Asia Pacific, right, there is a lot of debate and discussion around how there is the conversations around on a global scale, the conversation around climate is very unfair to the global south, right? And in local pockets and also internationally, I think it merits a lot of change in terms of policies, in terms of local actions. As we wrap the conversation today, Edward and Mia, thank you for taking out time for this conversation. I think
As we wrap up today's conversation, it's clear that the future of our planet rests in the hands of the next generation. Edward and Mia have shown us how education and youth leadership are key to driving meaningful change in climate action. The challenge is immense, but the opportunity for impact is even greater. Let's continue to inspire, empower, and support young people in shaping the world they will inherit. Thank you to our guests once again for sharing their insights, and to you, our listeners, for joining us on this journey. Until next time, let's stay committed to building a future that belongs to all of us.